and good afternoon, and a very warm welcome to the first webinar in the series titled Rebuild South Africa, jointly hosted by the Mapungubwe Institute for Strategic Reflection, MISTRA, and the Gauteng City Region Observatory. My name is Rashid Sidat, and I'm the Executive Director of the Gcro. I will be your Program Director for the rest of the afternoon. So welcome to everyone once again. I see we have, in order of something like 56 people who have come on board at the moment, and but we had received something like 350 registrations in the run-up to this particular event, and I'm sure the numbers will increase. But we are happy with I think that kind of people, because the kind of number that we're talking about, because we really want to have a fairly intensive, extensive, and insightful discussion on I think a very important set of issues and discussions this afternoon. In the registration list, there are people from a very wide range of disciplines in all walks of life. We have people from all spheres of government, national, provincial, local. We had somebody from parliament and provincial legislatures, from private companies, from organized business formations, labor, academics from many South African and some international universities, various research outfits, religious organizations, civics and residents groups, and the media, amongst others. So we hope that that kind of diversity that we have seen in the registration will materialize in the webinar this afternoon. So, but before I get into the substance of what we are going to talk about, let me just remind you on some housekeeping matters. Firstly, can you keep yourself muted and stop your video for better connectivity? So only the speaker, somebody who's on the floor, should basically keep the video and mic on. For the rest of the time, please keep it switched off. Everyone will have an opportunity to raise their points. I mean, this is an open webinar, meaning that we will allow people from the floor to speak during the discussion. You are welcome to pose your questions in the chat throughout the course of the webinar and during the discussion, and you may also raise your hands. Can you also please note that the session is being recorded? There's other information that will be shown in the chat, like speaker bios, although I will introduce all of the speakers properly when we come to them one by one. The links to the speaker organizations' websites, and as well as how to go live stream, if that's how you prefer doing it. So at this point, allow me to introduce the two hosting organizations, and that is the Gauteng City Region Observatory, abbreviated to Gcro, and the Mapungubwe Institute for Strategic Reflection, which is abbreviated, or the acronym is MISTRA. So these are the two organizations that are hosting today's event. But first, let me introduce the Gcro, of which, as I said, I'm the Executive Director. It is a partnership which is now 13 years in existence between the Gauteng Provincial Government, the University of Johannesburg, the University of the Witwatersrand, otherwise known as Wits University, and SALGA in Gauteng. In other words, local government in the province of Gauteng. The Gcro helps to build the knowledge base that government, business, labor, civil society, and residents need in order to make the Gauteng City region competitive, spatially integrated, environmentally sustainable, and socially inclusive. The Gcro collects data and benchmarks the city region, provides policy analysis and support, undertakes applied research, and publishes critically reflective academic work. The Other co-host is MISTRA, which is an independent think tank that takes a long-term view on the strategic challenges facing South Africa, the continent, and the globe. Since its inception in 2010, so MISTRA recently celebrated its 10th anniversary. It couldn't do so last year under conditions of the pandemic. So actually they're 11 years old at the moment, and they have assumed a leading position in long-term strategic and transdisciplinary research through generating research and creating platforms for engagement, much like this particular platform. Its research, policy debates, convening power, and scenario planning expertise have assisted in finding lasting and effective solutions to the challenges that the country, the continent, and the world are facing. So let me turn to the purpose of our webinar, just to give you, to frame, I think, what we are going to be talking about today, but fairly briefly. I'm going to leave the detail to the speakers. Events in South Africa over the last year and a half, 2020-21, have been extraordinary, including the recent turmoil in KZN and Gauteng, the devastating impact of COVID-19 on lives, livelihoods, and democracy in general, the low levels of economic growth that South Africa was experiencing even before the pandemic, and which worsened in 2020, as well as the challenges the state has been facing generally in the aftermath of state capture. So these issues collectively constitute the fundamental challenges facing the country, which require a multiplicity of voices, such as government, business, academia, and civil society, to unpack the issues and provide the insights that would help us rebuild South Africa. So what are we doing? MISTRA and Gcro fairly recently decided to enter into a partnership. And one of the first things that we felt we needed to do was really to focus in on the elephant in the room, as it were. The kind of fragmentation, the destruction, the economic malaise, etc., are things that concern all of us deeply. There is no doubt that these issues are being dealt with in many forums, and we think that we would like our voice as MISTRA and the Gcro, as well as the voices of the participants, to come to the fore, so that we can contribute towards the overall discourse that is currently unfolding in the country. So we have 3 webinars that we are hosting, which include number 1, the one today, and that's focusing on rebuilding communities. The second one, towards the end of October, on the 28th of October, is focused on rebuilding the economy. And the final one will be rebuilding government towards the end of November. And all of this, we hope to sort of pull together into what we're calling a document called a provocation, which will basically kind of say, analyzing what the issues are, but I think more importantly, the focus is on rebuilding. So how do we actually begin to think about those interventions that will assist us in rebuilding? So, so therefore, we are looking at the immediate causes and effects of the July 2021 events. We do understand that they are located in the frame of the broader challenges of poverty, inequality, and unemployment, and these have been cited as being at the root of the lack of social cohesion in South Africa. We will explore ideas, good practices, and initiatives that would build social cohesion in the country as a whole. So it's both an analysis as well as some ideas, the kernel of some really innovative, interesting, often grassroots ideas that will help us to begin this process of rebuilding. And the focus today is very much at the social domain in communities. So, colleagues, just to say that just to give a quick outline of the program before we start, we are going to have opening remarks and you can see it on your screen as well, and that will be done by Kolelwa Kashikatia from MISTRA. I will introduce a formula in a moment that will be followed by panelists, and the first panelist is Dr. Julia de Cut from the Gcro, and she will be talking about understanding community and social attitudes in Gauteng. As you can see, they all have 10 minutes. Dr. Vasu Gaunden from Accord will be speaking about mediation in local conflicts. And then finally, Dr. Bongiseni Butcher from PARI, the Public Affairs Research Institute, will talk about state reform and traditional leadership, what is to be done. This has no Leninist connotations, I don't think. Followed by rounds of discussion. And as you can see, I think unlike a lot of the webinars that we've had, which is just really about people, about many talking heads, we feel that it's really important to hear the voices of the people who are participating in today's discussion. So we're going to allow, and that's why the format is different, and we're going to allow you to both pose your questions in the chat, but also where possible, to get you to actually speak out loud, as it were. In other words, with your video and your mic on. I think that allows for, I think, a sense of the kinds of issues that people want to raise. But of course, you're going to be limited in your input. So keep it concise so that we're able to get to the kernel of the issue and then take it from there. And then we will allow for something like 20 minutes or so, or a little more than that, sorry, for each of the panelists to basically take into account what has been said by the other panelists as well as the participants, and basically give us some sort of final insights that we want to bring together. And then I'll do a closure of the program so that by 5 o'clock we are done. I know it's a bit of a longish program, but I think we can really promise all of you that it's going to be interesting. So please stay the course if you can. And I think that we're looking forward to a very interesting set of things. So let me, without further ado, introduce Ms. Kolelwa Kashe Katia from MISTRA. She holds a Master of Philosophy and MPhil degree in Heritage and Public Culture, which was done at the Center for African Studies at the University of Cape Town. Before that, she studied towards a BS degree also at UCT, where she majored in archaeology. After graduating from her undergraduate studies, she went on to complete an honors degree in physical anthropology at the University of Pretoria. In 2010, she was awarded a fellowship with the Archives and Public Culture Research Initiative. Her research interests are in the areas of knowledge production and the role of African studies in that regard. So over the last 20 years, she's worked as a researcher and a project manager in donor-funded public and academic environments. She joined MISTRA in 2013 as the head of consultancy services and since been promoted to the position of Director of Project Management, a position she currently holds. In this portfolio, Kolelwa is responsible for the implementation, monitoring, and evaluation of research projects, business development, and the identification of new and relevant opportunities for consultancy work at MISTRA. She's also the executive committee member of the Indlulamiti Essay Scenarios and a board member of the online portal South African History Online. So over to you, Kolelwa, and I understand you have a presentation, so you can please take us through that. Thank you. You have 10 minutes.
Thank you so much, Chair, for that introduction. And as indicated, I'll be using some slides to actually engage with the topic that is under discussion today. But also, I think just before I begin with with my address, is that what we need to hold in our minds is the long-term view, to the challenges of that that came as a result of the July 2021 protests. But also we need to be mindful of the historical perspective. And I suppose this is also informed by my own research interests, which have to do with, history, in particular, the long and deep history, but also as part of doing so, being mindful of the need to think of lasting and also resilient solutions to these challenges that we are facing as a country, and one of them being the issue of protest and violent protest in particular. And therefore, how do we then rebuild our communities in terms of that? Now, today's topic, as introduced by Rashid, is that we intend to explore some of the immediate causes and the effects of the July 2021 events, but these have to be located within the broader framework of the challenges of poverty, inequality, unemployment, which have been cited as the root, as a root cause, to the lack of cohesion in South Africa. Now, just a little bit about the work we've been doing at the Mapungubwe Institute for Strategic Reflection. I mean, it was introduced by the chair, but I just want to, bring your attention to, our strategy, which is informed by the long-term view or perspective in terms of engaging with the challenges facing South Africa, the continent, and also the globe. But also, MISTRA is also involved in long-term strategic forecasting, and this we do through scenarios planning. The Institute also conducts a strategic research in terms of various policy issues where we address a whole lot of challenges that were identified at inception when MISTRA was founded back in 2010. And we've been releasing these research products over the past 10 years, and we've got an excess of about 20 such priority research products. But some of the examples of the specific issues that we deal with are, the political economy of mining, social compacting, which is relevant for today's discussion, but also, how do we transition the country to a low carbon economy, as we know that our mining sector is actually, dominated by coal mining, which also gives us another challenge. So as part of these strategic challenges we've been reflecting on, and some of the topics that we identified 10 years ago, one of those topics was that of protest, in particular violent protests. And what we're doing now, we felt that there was a need to actually bring forward that research through a priority research projects that is soon to begin. But at the moment, we've been reflecting as MISTRA staff internally to find ways to understand the underpinnings of the violent protest in South Africa. And we do this by looking at its origins and so on. But the recent spread of community protests, and I've used the example of the xenophobic violence of May 2008, but there's also been the mine strike, the mine workers' strike in Marikana in 2011, and then also the emergence or the rise of the Fallist movement through the student protests across universities that started in 2015 and continues into the present. So what are these continuities telling us? Again, I'd like to remind you of the historical perspective, because some would argue that violent protest is part of what we would call South African heritage, because this is something that has always been deployed as a strategy, even during apartheid and before that, wherein protest has been one of the tools deployed, towards the liberation of our people. Now, this new wave of protests, that is the July 2021 protests, in terms of our thinking so far as the Mapungubwe Institute for Strategic Reflection, is that this unrest that seemed to have been amplified in Gauteng and especially in KwaZulu-Natal seems to be in contrast to the broader experience of popular protests in South Africa. However, some of these things that sets it apart from others have been identified as, the foreplanning that was involved, and this foreplanning coordinated by those who are politically motivated, but was also high levels of targeted criminality. And also there's been an emergence of, ethnic and racial tensions that we witnessed during that time. And others have argued that there's been this unusual trigger of events, which is then the arrest of the former President Zuma. Now, this PRP that we're imagining will look at all these things, but also look at the interconnectedness of this crisis, to explore issues of the political, economic, and social factors, but also would like to provoke our thinking by also extending, our thinking beyond our borders, but to also look at the continental and global context, because there seems to be a rise in, protests across the globe. So these are the things that we are thinking about, but we don't want to essentialize this 2021 July protest, because we may as well argue that this is only an intensification of what happens in South Africa in any way. So what happens there is something that actually reflects a South African reality. And I'd like to actually support this by looking at the work that Mistra has done through the Intra-Community South African scenarios, wherein we identified similar challenges that seem to be emerging across all the scenarios that were written by the initiatives. But just to take a step back into why we designed those scenarios, it was because we wanted to answer the question that about social cohesion in South Africa. And the key question then was, what would a socially cohesive South Africa look like? And to what degree is it attainable by 2030? And part of that process then identified key drivers to that. First one being this issue of resistance, resentment, and reconciliation. We've seen South Africans wrangling over the constitution. We've seen us fighting it out over identity issues. And this was actually strongly experienced during the student protests. There's also the issue of institutional capacity and leadership. So this lack of leadership, which is not only limited to the state, but across the spectrum, whether it's in business or in civil society, or even in our own homes, there is this erosion of ethical leadership in our country. The last one being social inequality. And this is not just material inequality, it's inequality in all its facets, whether it's about access to networks, or where you are located in the country, if you're in the Eastern Cape, or in terms of access to just the basic services. So these yielded then the three storylines, which are Gwara, Isibujwa, and Nile Walk. If you look at the three scenarios, you can see that there is expression of violent protest across all three of them. In Gwara, which is a nation that's torn between immobility, restless energy, but it also it embodies a demoralized land of disorder and decay. So that's where you find that there's all these violent and sporadic protests across the landscape, but they're so disorganized but informed by a demoralized citizenry. Isibujwa, we also see violent protests, but also this is also informed by the essence of this scenario, which is increasing social divides. So what you would see is that how we express, our dissatisfaction is informed by our own self-interest. So if I'm in the elite or part of the Black middle class, my protest will be informed by my own interests without consideration of the whole. In Nile Walk, again, we see a different form of, active citizenry. I'd like to also maybe start, being mindful of the naming of these protests or violent protests. And sometimes I would do this when I speak to that, because in this sense, we see now choreographed promotion of constitutionalism. And this is something that's driven by the citizens, whether they step outside, spill out onto the streets to ensure that the ruling party of the day addresses, issues that are encompassed by the constitution. It is still activism nonetheless. Whether it's negative as expressed in Gwara or Isibujwa, it is a form of expression or a form of agency by the citizens. And now over the years, as Intra-Community, we've been doing a barometer to measure the drift of the country, in terms of the three key driving forces that I've mentioned. And to date, what we've seen is that South Africa is actually in Gwara nation, and the strongest pull being that of social inequality. As you can see in 2020, what is green is Gwara, the expression of Gwara in terms of social inequality. And we saw that this year we slipped further into Gwara, and it's now 85%. And if you aggregate...
Sorry, Claudia, you've got 2 minutes left.
Okay, thank you, thank you. I'm about to wrap up. So if you look at this, you can see that overall result is that it is confirmed that we are in that Gwara nation, which is a demoralized citizenry. And year on year since 2019, we've been slipping deeper and deeper into Gwara. As you can see what's in the green there, 2019, 2020, and 2021. And as explained, how violent protest is expressed in the Gwara nation. Now, a part of our work at Intergenerational and also Mistra has been that of looking at social compacts, the potential thereof. So far, we've looked at how other countries have dealt with social compacting, because we thought that with a country that has a loaded history such as ours, then compacting seems to be the solution that other countries have actually utilized to find cohesion or to deal with specific issues. Now, what I'd like to do is to provoke the panelists to start thinking about ways through which South Africa can imagine a compact or compacts, because there's also this argument for multiple compacts. And it could be compacts that are issue specific, but also there's potential for compacts at local level. And I suppose then that brings us to the topic of today, wherein we speak to that particular moment of July 2021. What are the potentials for compacting in those areas? Is there potential for an issue-specific compact around poverty or around that specific area of KZN where these things erupted? And I think, Chair, that will bring me to the end of my presentation, and I hope I've managed to provoke the panelists enough so that we can start thinking about resilient and lasting solutions to this historical challenge or historical strategy, or as stated in my presentation, it could be a way, a heritage of demonstrating agency as citizens. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kolelwa. I think that was really sort of interesting. I think in a very concise way, you've been able to summarize, I think, some of the key underlying factors that led to the events in July. And I think you've posed a particular challenge, not only to the panelists, but also to the rest of the participants. And I think we will most certainly pick up on that. I want to move on to our next speaker, or rather our first panelist, and that's Dr. Julia de Cat from the Gcro, and she's going to be doing a presentation. Julia is a senior researcher at the Gcro with a particular focus on supporting the quality of life survey. She has a long-standing interest in the use of various empirical data, including large-scale surveys, to better understand post-apartheid South Africa. Substantively, Julia is particularly interested in issues facing youth and access to services such as health, education, and economic opportunity. She earned her PhD from Wits University in 2011. Her thesis explored the distances which primary school children in Johannesburg traveled to attend school in the immediate post-apartheid period, relying on data from a range of sources, including the Birth to 20 cohort study. She holds a master's in political science and public policy from Princeton University, one of the Ivy Leagues, and another of the kind of her undergrad degree was at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT. More recently, Julia has worked with iTech South Africa, the Center for Health Policy at Wits, on a range of research projects exploring different approaches to the provision of healthcare services in South Africa, with a particular focus on the potential role of community health workers. Over to you, Julia. Thank you. Your time starts now.
Thank you so much, Sue. I'm just suddenly struggling to share my screen. There we go. Can you see that all right?
Yeah, that's fine, thank you.
Right.
Oh, well, it's still blank. All right, we got it.
Is it working? Okay, super. Thank you very much, Rashid. So good afternoon. My contribution to the webinar today is going to be to share some of the results from the Gcro's latest Quality of Life survey, which we launched earlier this month. These results paint a really stark picture of life in Gauteng in 2020 and 21 and highlight the extent of the social and economic devastation the province has experienced in the past 18 months or so. We concluded our data collection for the survey in May 2021. So in advance of the third wave of COVID that hit Gauteng, and also in advance of July's social upheavals, we can only imagine that these events have made life even harder for many residents. There really is a huge amount of rebuilding for us to do. The results I'm going to share today don't tell us and can't tell us exactly why July's unrest occurred, but what they can do is shed some light on how people in Gauteng were living, thinking, and feeling in the months running up to the unrest. This contextual information is crucial as we begin to think about how best to rebuild the province and the country. Before I get started, I'd just like to acknowledge Geospace International, who were responsible for our data collection, and Gcro and other colleagues who've contributed to the analysis I'm presenting today. I'd like to also thank our funders in Gauteng Provincial Government and the cities of Ekurhuleni, Johannesburg, and Tshwane. The Gcro's Quality of Life Survey, or QUAL for short, has been conducted every 2 years since 2009. Our data is longitudinally comparable, which means we can look at changes and trends in life in the province over time. QUAL is a large-scale survey with respondents sampled randomly and interviewed at their homes across all the wards of the province. Our 6th iteration of the Quality of Life Survey took place from October 2020 to May 2021, and our final data set includes responses from 13,616 residents of the province. Their distribution is evident in this map here. We interviewed at least 20 people in each ward of the province and over 600 in each municipality. We've weighted our data to ensure that it is representative of Gauteng's adult population. One of the questions we asked our respondents was whether they'd experienced a protest in their neighborhood in the past year. We also asked whether they'd participated in a protest, whether they'd participated in participatory governance activities such as IDPs, ward meetings, and so on, or in social activities such as church groups, sports, or social clubs. It's important to remember that given the timing of our data collection, when we were asking about the past year, much of that period was spent during pretty stringent lockdown conditions. Consequently, we were a bit surprised to see that there's been quite an increase in the proportion of residents who report to us that they experienced a protest in their neighborhood in the past year. We were also slightly surprised to see small increases in engagement in participatory governance and social activities. Where people reported experiencing protests in their neighborhoods, we asked them what the protest was about, and just about 60% of the protests reported were related to electricity. If we bring in other basic services, combining electricity and other basic services, this was explaining over 80% of the protests. Another 5% were attributed to crime. And I think it's worth noting that only 3% of protests were reported to be about foreigners. These figures really present an image of an engaged and active population, which is in many ways extremely positive. What is concerning, though, is that these relatively high levels of engagement with participatory governance processes are leaving pretty basic needs unmet, which is then spilling out into protest. I mentioned previously that our results show evidence of economic devastation, and I don't use that term lightly. In this table, we look at the proportion of households of residents living below the poverty line in our recent iterations of the QUAL survey. Here you can see that since 2013-14, we've witnessed a steady decline in the proportion of people living under the poverty line, down to 24% in QUAL 5, 2017-18, noting that even this is still a pretty concerning and high figure. However, in 2021, it's shot right back up past where we were in 2013-14 And we see now 36% of adults in the province living below the poverty line. That's over 1/3 of resident adults. Who are these additional people who are now living in poverty? Our data suggests they're mostly people who were previously living in lower and lower middle income categories. Here we can see the distribution of our respondents across income categories for the 3 most recent iterations of our survey. What's very clear here in 2021 is the big drop in this lower middle income category and a small decrease in the lower income category and a big jump up in those living on very, very limited income. By contrast, if we look at the top of the scale, the proportion of respondents in the higher income categories has remained pretty much constant over time. This suggests to us that the most affluent have been relatively protected from the worsening economic situation. This pattern is indicative of worsening in income inequality in a context which was already one of the most unequal globally. We also know that inequality is a very strong predictor of social unrest. Given the massive rise in poverty that we've seen, it's striking that when asked about the biggest problem in their communities, people were more likely to say this was crime than they were to say it was unemployment. And indeed, we also have seen that levels of exposure to physical violence are extraordinarily high. 16% of adults reported having experienced physical violence against them in the past year alone. And residents also do not feel like government is doing its job with regard to violence and crime. Only 27% report that they're satisfied with government safety and security services. Given this context, it's unsurprising that we see that satisfaction with government has plummeted in 2020-21 across all 3 spheres of government. Additionally, we see that 24%, or just below a quarter of respondents, say that they trust the current leaders of government. Furthermore, an even smaller proportion of 17% say that government officials typically adhere to Batopele principles. By contrast, when we look at how people feel about their communities, our findings are actually much more encouraging. Here we see that the proportion of residents who believe that most people in their neighborhood or community can be trusted has increased quite notably over time, including an increase during the recent extremely challenging period. A note of caution is that we do see quite different patterns across the population groups and a much greater increase in trust among Indian, Asian, and white respondents when compared to Black, African, and colored respondents. In addition, relative to 2017-18, people are also less likely to feel that they cannot influence developments in their community. Similarly, people are also less likely to feel that nobody cares about people like them. There's also a small but positive shift in responses to the question, do you agree that Blacks and whites will never trust each other? The proportion agreeing that Blacks and whites will never trust each other has dropped from 64% in 2017-18 to just 4 points down to 60% in 2020-21. Again, however, if we look at the different population groups, we do see substantial variations here, which again is grounds for concern. In particular, we can see that Black African residents are much more likely to believe that Blacks and whites will never trust each other than other population groups, and particularly compared to white residents. However, I do think it's worth noting that given the extent of racially aligned inequality we experience in the province, the fact that there is any decrease here at all is somewhat striking. Finally, we also see that attitudes towards vulnerable groups have continued to soften over time. Here we can see that over time, an increasing proportion of respondents say that they strongly disagree with the use of violence against gays and lesbians, and those who agree with the use of violence has really declined to just a very, very tiny proportion of the population. We see similar responses in questions about violence to foreigners. Here we can also see that respondents over time are notably less likely to say that all foreigners should be sent home. This is down to 13% in 2020-21. And there's a growth over time in the proportion of Gauteng residents who think that legal foreigners are okay and should be allowed to stay in the country.
Julia, you got to round up?
Great, yeah. So these more positive findings about social and community cohesion really suggests to us that Gauteng's people and communities offer a great resource to the province in building back. Despite a profoundly challenging period, people have become more trusting of those around them and more accepting of differences. Despite lockdowns, we've actually seen social engagement increasing, and despite frustrations over service delivery, people have continued to engage in participatory governance. All of this is valuable, but it's not enough. The brutal realities of poverty, inequality, crime, and violence need to be addressed, and civil society can't do this alone. One of our respondents told us we need to be able to trust our authorities. And I think this is really the moment for government to begin to rebuild this trust, particularly by working closely, collaboratively, and transparently with communities and civil society to meet the needs of their constituents. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Julia. I think that was, there were already comments in the chat. I think people really sort of enjoyed the presentation. But without further ado, I'm going to call upon our next speaker, and that is Dr. Vasu Gaunden. And he's going to be speaking about mediation in local conflicts. I'm going to give his bio, his short bio, just to give you a sense about the kind of work that he's been involved in. Vasu Gaunden is the founder and executive director of the African Center for Constructive Resolution of Disputes Accord, which he founded in 1992. It is today a globally recognized conflict management institute, and it has been rated by Pennsylvania University's annual think tank, ranking in the top 100 think tanks globally for 11 consecutive years. In 2018, Vasu founded Global Peace to mobilize a global constituency to strengthen multilateralism and to build a better world. Vasu was a Fulbright scholar at Georgetown University, where he graduated with an LLM and is admitted to the High Court of South Africa as an advocate. Over the last 29 years, he has been involved in preparing conflicting parties across Africa for political negotiations. He has supported the facilitators in the peace processes in Burundi, the DRC, Madagascar, Sudan, South Sudan, and Somalia. He's currently involved in the Sudan peace process. Vasu has served on several commissions in this country and serves on the boards of several international institutions across the world, including the steering committee of the Paris Peace Forum, the advisory board of the Cyber Peace Institute, the Global Citizen 2020 Policy Advisory Subcommittee. He has addressed the United Nations Security Council on several occasions on matters relating to conflict management, and has been elected by the World Economic Forum as one of the global leaders of tomorrow. But I think we understand him to be a global leader of today. Vasu, over to you. And you have 10 minutes. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Rashid. I'm starting my stopwatch also on my phone. So if I look that way, it's because I'm checking the time. Thank you to GCRO and Mistra for inviting me. I'm going to focus, Rashid, directly on the incidents of the days in July. And as you have correctly pointed out, I have worked the last 29 years across the continent and in Syria, Palestine, Sri Lanka, Nicaragua. So this movie that is evolving in South Africa, I have seen before in many, many places. And I can tell you that it doesn't bode well for South Africa, which I'm sure also the Mistra scenarios point towards. And the presentation that we've just had now also from Julia points in the same direction. So the incidents, to answer the question directly, mediation of local conflicts, yes, it's possible to mediate local conflicts. That's where most of our efforts now on the continent will concentrate, is local and national conflicts, and I'll say why. And then, of course, there will be the conflicts at a national level, as we are currently involved with the Sudan People's Liberation Movement and the government of Sudan. But if we look at those incidents in July, and I think it shocked the nation as it shocked the world, it's not the first time that we have seen this in South Africa. We have seen this in South Africa previously on many, many occasions, but there are some fundamental differences this time that I think if we don't take steps to resolve or mitigate soon, it will lead us in a direction that we don't want to go as South Africa. Now, we know, for example, in the early 90s and the late 80s, we had many similar conflicts in South Africa. And yes, at the time, we were trying to dismantle the system of apartheid that in many ways entrenched poverty, unemployment, and inequality. So there's a big question mark now. Was the incidents or the drivers of the incidents in July, poverty, unemployment, and inequality? There's an unequivocal yes to that question. And yes, it happened also in the late 80s, 90s, and the entire period of apartheid, and prior to that, colonization, where, as I said, we tried to dismantle. I think we underestimated, those of us who were involved in the struggle, those who got involved later in the transformation of our society, underestimated just how long, how difficult and complex a challenge it would be to dismantle the structural impediments that we inherited from apartheid. And unfortunately, I think as we see today, those have actually exacerbated, and that's what led to a lot of those incidents. Now, what were the differences between what happened previously and now? And I want to focus a little bit on that, so that during question time, people can ask me to unpack that, and I'm very happy to unpack that. So if we take, for example, 91, 92, 93, many of you will remember that we had heightened levels of violence in South Africa. And the same underlying causes of those conflicts in South Africa. I'm going to ask Tamlin to put up a slide. I have only one slide that I'm going to ask you to look at. Okay, so if you can enlarge the one slide. Okay, so this is our own analysis of where South Africa finds itself, where many countries on the continent find themselves. And that is the center circle is the elite, and that might include most of the people, the 113 people that are on this webinar. And what puts people at the center is that we have skills and access to capital, and that gives us mobility in society. So we can move from the state to the private sector, to academia, to civil society, and essentially we have livelihoods. The second circle, that's where the major problems, challenges will come in the future. And that's where we saw the major challenges in those days in July. And these are the impediments that we have not managed to deal with, that we inherited from apartheid. So, and then you've got, of course, the marginalized periphery. And these are deeply structural problems driven by the fact that we have not managed effectively to transform our societies. And the big question is, by 2030, would we have made enough progress to build social cohesion or a semblance of social cohesion in South Africa? At the current rate, the answer is a definite no. And so we have to think about what would we have to put in place in order to do this. This mirrors very much, as many of you will remember, President Thabo Mbeki's famous two-nation speech. And I think last year, he's alluded to the fact, or he said, South Africa has not yet reached the tipping point. And the tipping point for us is when the second circle gets so large that it becomes totally unmanageable for the state, and the state structures and systems start to break down. And we saw the beginnings of that in the 5 days in July. So what is the difference between what happened in the early 90s and what happened in those 5 days? And why are those differences so serious for us as a country? So the first is that since the early 1990s, our population has grown exponentially. Secondly, we are more urbanized as a society. Thirdly, I think we saw very starkly the failure of state security institutions. And thirdly, fourthly, and more importantly, the failure of local, and I would say to a large extent also national political leadership and community leadership. And that is a serious problem. I can remember for many of us who were involved in the struggle, and I see people like Maggie Govender and others on this webinar, you will remember that, yes, we did mobilize and take thousands of people on the streets in the 80s and in the early 90s. The difference then was that those of us who were in political community leadership positions, and I was the president of the SRC at Durban Westville during the state of emergency in 85 and 86. So I know we did lead thousands on the streets, but we did have enough control over the people we took on the street. So we knew that if we took people out, we knew when we could pull them back. The problem that we saw in those 5 days is whoever organized it lost control by the second day. And that is an extremely serious challenge that we face as a country, the disintegration of political parties and the lack of political leadership at that level. The next thing was the breakdown in value. So apart from people who might be seething in poverty, unemployment, inequality, who took to the streets, who looted and engaged in a protest, we also saw a lot of wealthy people line up their vehicles and go and loot in those buildings. And that shows that there is also a breakdown of our value system. And that is also a very worrying factor. And then the last kind of worrying factor, and I see I'm at 8 minutes now, is the fact that private citizens then took up arms where the state failed to secure them. And that, for me, is where we will be going as many of the other countries edged towards civil war on the continent. And that started because state authority and security broke down. And if we aren't able to pull that back and to reinstitute confidence in the state security apparatus and the entire state security system, from police all the way to justice, then that will lead us into very, very dangerous territory. And the genie is out of the bottle. People have taken to arms to protect themselves. They're not going to put those weapons back. If there are other incidents, they're going to take those weapons out again. And so there are serious indications that we could go back to where we were in the early 90s, where we edged towards a civil war. As many of you know, that CODESA was one forum in which we managed to pull that back, but the National Peace Accord and the structures that we built on the ground to mediate local community conflicts and to deal with them at the source also assisted in bringing some stability. So where do we go from here in the last minute is that, firstly, I think we need a new social compact, and I can say some of that when we conclude. But secondly, we need the transformation of state systems. And thirdly, we need a dialogue and mediation strategy on the ground. Thank you, Rashid.
Thank you so much, Vasu. That was, I think, very sort of concise. We'll pick up, I think, a number of the threads that you had sort of put up. But let us go to our final speaker, and that is Dr. Bongiseni Butcher, who holds a PhD in English and Comparative Literature from Columbia University in New York, We also obtained an MPhil in English and Comparative Literature. He's a dedicated scholar who graduated cum laude from both the University of KZN and the University of Natal, earning an MA in English Studies and a BA Honours in English and Drama, respectively. Working in various academic and activist capacities, Bongiseni has been interested in how the state interfaces with citizens in areas that include land restitution, the role of traditional leaders in governance, heritage, and public archives. With various collaborators, he has researched and written on the state's constructions of the identity of citizens in KZN through heritage discourse and commemorative events. He has also written on land and citizenship rights in rural areas and the role of traditional leaders in the realization of these rights, as well as the dire state of public archives and its implications for accountable government. And Bongiseni is going to talk about state reform and traditional leadership. Thank you. Over to you, Bongiseni.
Thank you very much, Rashid. And I think this follows on quite nicely from what Vasu has said. What I want to do in the next 10 minutes is just offer a provocation that I think moves us from what Vasu talked about, which is, I think most of our perspectives are probably from urban areas for the most part. And I want to think about what happens in the countryside. So there are two sets of questions I want to pose and offer some some thoughts on. The first set is, the first question really is, since the advent of democracy, has life got better for people who live in the countryside? And here I'm talking about the so-called former homelands of Bantu and Bantustans, people who live on farms, etc. I'm going to focus mostly on the former homelands and Bantustans and use the vantage point of KwaZulu-Natal, where I've spent time doing research for the last 20 years or so. And then the second set of questions is, what role have traditional leaders played to get us where we are? What role can they play going forward? So why focus on this? I think going back to my earlier point, our vantage points are often from urban areas, and what we often see, particularly in mainstream media, is a great bias towards urban areas. We kind of forget in many ways about what's going on in the rural areas of this country. And here we're talking about areas that accommodate about 18 million people of our population. That excludes people who migrate back and forth between the urban and rural areas. So let me start by saying, the first point I want to make is that things have got both better and worse. It's been uneven for people in rural areas. They're better off in terms of rights, for example, things like freedom of movement, bodily integrity, not suffering the kind of abuses of authoritarian regimes that I, in part, grew up experiencing in KwaZulu, for example. There are better life prospects for some. And here I want to refer to a recent study done by PLAS at the University of the Western Cape that shows that some of the people who are better off, the study was a case study looking at a farming area, commercial farming area in Vienna in KwaZulu-Natal. And one of the things that it showed, which was quite interesting, was when commercial farming is contributing very little, in fact, to improving the lives of people. And people who are getting better off are people who are either teachers, police officers who work for the state in those areas, but a lot of people around those farming areas are dependent on social grants. Social grants are another element that has made people's lives slightly better. But at the same time, we could also say people's lives are getting worse off. People are worse off in some areas. So here I'm talking about areas where there's extractive economic activity. Mining is one of those, and there are conflicts. I've been involved in researching some of them in the several provinces when I was at the Land and Accountability Research Center at the University of Cape Town. It's gotten worse in some places where the mining frontier has moved to places that are in the former homelands, as some of the work Mistra has done has shown, and that has meant that then we have these extractive economies. We have the growth of shopping malls, for example, in the countryside in ways that we haven't seen before. And what they're doing is extracting value and shipping it elsewhere, mostly to urban areas. Well, this has led to conflicts over land between traditional authorities and communities seeking to hold accountable their traditional leaders. The state, I think, has made things worse in that if you look at the track record of laws passed by the state, they've been moving more and more towards giving unaccountable power to traditional authorities in rural areas. There's also what I want to call the ghostly presence of the state in rural areas. The state has a very thin presence in many places. Some of the villages where I've spent a lot of time, where some of my relatives live in northern KwaZulu-Natal, if there's a school in the village, that is just about the extent of the state. When it comes to what Vasu was talking about, the presence, for example, of security in some of the areas of work done by the Center for Law and Society at the University of Cape Town, people will call the police when there's an incident of crime. They're lucky if the police arrive within 24 hours. So in places where I've also spent a bit of time around Vienna, where one of my brothers has been farming, there are a lot of armed groups who simply take the law into their own hands. And there's a gun culture in the Midlands in KwaZulu-Natal that is quite extensive, and that feeds into what I think Vasu was talking about. That is one of the things that we need to really pay attention to. The role of traditional leaders has also been uneven. In many places, what we've seen is that a great deal of rent extraction and self-enrichment by those who, the elites that Vasu was talking about, those who hold power in rural areas. When it comes to mining deals, when it comes to land allocation, for example, we've seen the best lands. We've seen people getting themselves onto boards of mining companies as traditional leaders and extracting rents from their communities, monies that are supposed to be going towards community development, that are being paid by mining companies, are being extracted by traditional leaders. Organizations like Corruption Watch in recent work have shown this. The Land and Accountability Research Center at the University of Cape Town has shown this as well, and has been involved a great deal of litigation, in fact, to try and push back against these practices. And all of this is aided by both state absence, the kind of ghostly absence I was talking about, which has led to, in many ways, what we see as local accommodations between elected authorities and traditional leaders with the advent of wall-to-wall local government in the 1990s. What Michael Williams in the book titled Chieftaincy, the State and Democracy has shown to be these parallel systems that have had to find ways of accommodating each other. Traditional leaders, elected local government, without really much direction from the state. And as I've suggested earlier, with the thrust of national legislation moving towards giving unaccountable powers to traditional authorities, some of which we've seen, in fact, in the signing of the recent Traditional and Khoisan Leadership Act by President Ramaphosa into law. There's also, at the same time, the unevenness means people living in traditional areas also have to have the option of either opting into the traditional system when they need something done, for example, need a letter to prove their residence. In some cases, they shop forums. They can go to the traditional leader and get a letter, or they can go to the municipal office or the councillor's office, councillor's house, in many cases, and get that letter. So you also have a lot of contestation between traditional leaders and elected councillors in a lot of places. State lawmaking has just kept compounding the issues. So what is to be done? Let me end off with some thoughts, some suggestions of some of the things that need to be done. I'm going to keep them high level, and we can delve into some of the detail later on as well. One of the things that we've seen, for example, is that in KwaZulu-Natal recently, there's the Ingonyama Trust case in court. And the outcome of that case, which over many years made its way through the court, was that the way in which the trust has been converting people's indigenous land rights into leasehold has now been, the court has said this needs to be reversed, and these leases that have been given out to people People need to be refunded monies they've paid over the last decade or so to the Ngonyama Trust for these leases. So that, I think, points us in the direction of where we need to go, which is that land in rural areas need to be given to people rather than unaccountable structures. I think that Ngonyama Trust case judgment and heralds something that we're going to hear a lot about. And 3 days ago, the Minister of Rural Development and Land Reform said they're setting up a new directorate, in fact, to deal with and to do what the court has said needs to be done. So the question of land redistribution in particular, is something that can help us towards thinking about what social cohesion looks like in rural areas. The second thing I want to also put this in a slightly obtuse way, is that one of the problems we deal with is legacies of colonialism. And legacies have been mentioned here, where the question of the role of traditional leaders vis-a-vis the state has never been resolved in South Africa. There are questions of sovereignty. The traditional leaders want to think of themselves as sovereign leaders whose existence predates the state. There's the question of are traditional leaders actually state employees? And one of my former colleagues, Tuto Tipe, put it quite starkly lately. And she said, yes, they draw salaries from the state. So they're state employees. And so we need to finally, I think, resolve this question of where authority lies between traditional leaders and the state. It's a question of a sort of overlordship by the state, which in many ways repeats colonial arrangements, but we need to resolve this in order to be able to think about social cohesion in rural areas. What we have now is fueling conflict between people and leaders. And then lastly, I want to say, I put this in the language of state reform, because there's a lot of talk at the national level about reforming the state towards it making it function better. I serve on a task team, for example, that is thinking about how to make the state more professional. I think we need to bring this question of traditional leaders and communities in rural areas into that frame of reform, the major reforms that need to be done. And we need to not lose sight of those when we're thinking about reforming the public service, for example. This is part of that bigger basket of reforms that we need to be thinking about going forward. And I'll stop there for now. Thank you very much, Rashid.
Okay, thanks a lot, Bongiseni. I think, let me just say a couple of things. I know we're running about sort of 10 or 15 minutes late, but the inputs were absolutely enlightening. And I think they were also, they were interconnected. And certainly, I think what Kolelo was saying in relation to the underlying sort of issues resonated very much with what Vasu was saying also about the underlying issues. And I think there was some kind of agreement about that. But how to go forward, Kolelo raised the issue of the National Social Compact, and that's something that I think we need to pick up in the discussion. I think Julia basically gave us the sense of what the issues were. Sorry about that. In relation to the kind of social conditions that exist in this province, in Gauteng. And then, of course, I think Vasu, aside from analyzing the problem, basically was putting forward at a very high level, I think, some of the things that were lacking, which in a way we need to address to basically fix, if you see what I'm saying, like issues like failure of state security, of leadership, et cetera, et cetera. So, and then Bongiseni, I think quite correctly, and I think we were absolutely right in saying this sort of urban bias that we all have needs to be sort of counterbalanced by a sense of what's actually happening in rural areas. And there the dynamics are significantly different, as he was pointing out. And again, I think he was pointing to some issues around how do we begin to address those issues. So those are the kinds of issues that I think we are dealing with. I know I'm going to get into trouble here, so please forgive me in advance, but I need to acknowledge, I think, some key people who are here. I think the chairperson of the Board of Governors of MISTRA, Professor Sibusiso Vilumkomo. Thank you very much for attending, Prof. I think we would really like to hear your insights. There is Lisa Seftel from Naledi, dealing with, I think, the social partners at a very high level. There's my old comrade Ishmael Mkhabela, who I spent some time with in detention during the second state of emergency. I know he's very much a grassroots person, and we'd like to hear from him. And other people in civil society, people like Sean Bolton from the Kathrada Foundation. I see Lisa saying she's from Nedlek. Sorry, Nedlek. Yeah, you're right, Lisa. Sorry. I don't know why I said Naledi. Nedlek. We all know what Nedlek is. Maggie Govender, the MEC, the former MEC and now MPL in KZN, working very much at the grassroots level. I mean, these are just some of the people. I'm going to go through the list again. So I'm just highlighting some of the people. But before we get some of those people to say a few words, if they want to, I'm going to take the specific questions that we did get, and let me start. And I'm going to ask, if possible, Mwatlodi had raised two questions, one for Kolelwa, and I think, I'm not sure who the other one was for. I think it was from Vasu, I think, for Vasu. I'm not sure, but maybe Mwatlodi, you actually want to switch on your video and basically talk a little about that and your questions, and then we'll go to Nonkubela Maliza, who had asked Julia a particular question. We're not going to get the panelists to answer now. They can do so in their slot a little later on, but for now, let us get what the participants in the discussion are actually saying. So, Mwatlodi, are you happy to come on board? Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Chairperson. I had not hoped to put my camera on, but my questions really are about a fundamental question at the center that we probably need to be addressing. And I just want to check if there's courage to address the economic question, social impacts, social cohesion, and all these other social and skills and all sorts of things we're talking about. Will they bring fundamental solutions to what we are facing? For both speakers, are we having courage to address the colonial question of the untouched, economic injustices that continue to perpetuate what we see today? That's really the fundamental question that I'm raising. Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you.
That was short and sweet. Nonkubela, I see you're on, so please come through.
Yeah, I'll also be very short and sweet. I was just saying that the QOL, or the Call Survey results, are really most encouraging particularly insofar as the results about social cohesion in communities, even despite the disparity amongst the various race groups, although, I mean, maybe that's where we need to dig into. But I was just saying that those findings have been completely upended, in my view, by the July 2021 unrest. And so, I mean, how do we then reinterpret or understand them in light of what really happened there? I have another question from Bongiseni. I don't know whether to ask it now or to ask it later.
Please go ahead. Okay.
So to Bongiseni, really found a lot of what he said so resonating. But he said, one of the points he said is that the solution he was advocating is that land needs to be given to people and individuals rather than to unaccountable structures such as Ingonyama Trust. But the question I pose is, there have been so many farms, productive farms that have been given. I know it's not enough, but a number of farms have been given through certain schemes that the government has had to many emerging and Black farmers. And most of those farms are now either lying fallow, disintegrated or degraded significantly because mismanagement, squandering of money, etc. Co-ops also have not been so successful. They don't have a track record of success because of the lack of cohesion and fragmentation in communities and lack of leadership. So how does this suggest, because we need an organizing framework in which to give the land to even these individuals, and there's not enough land to go to every individual. How would he, what would be his response to that?
Okay, so maybe I should just keep my my camera on, so I don't have to keep switching it on and off. Is there another question here? So let me just check in the chat. Hangwi Lipatsi, do you want to make an input?
Yes, my question really is to all the panelists who spoke. I just wanted to grapple with the idea of what is the output, what is the history? The history of South Africa then is very exclusionary and it excludes the majority. And then there's this idea that you must include the majority. So I'm interested in that when you do include them, but they don't set the agenda from their value systems, their ideas of life and their ways of being, does this not cause a lack of ownership of the institutions you've placed them in, almost then creating an incentive to just use these institutions for gain, not develop them any further than they found them, but then also create people who have a lot to gain from the institutions as they sit without necessarily expanding them. And you see this in the corruptions that comes from politicians, traditional leaders who, even though they've got a base, a constituency, they don't use that constituency to develop. So coming from this exclusionary sense of existence that South Africa has already had and excluding a majority, but then the post-1994 movement sort of like wants to include the majority without allowing them to necessarily set the tones in those institutions. What becomes the outcome of that from am I really here to build a patriotic South Africa in these institutions, or am I here to at least find what I can get from the little opportunities that have opened up for me, given that there isn't a lot of opportunity that opens up? So I think it touches on what Dr. Buthelezi spoke about as well. But my second question is really also now saying, okay, now that we are here, what does it mean then to be South African? Can anybody here actually answer that question? That what are we living for, all of us here, to say this is the structure or the foundation under which we do all the work that we do, whether I'm a sports person, whether I'm a politician, whether I'm a traditional leader, whether I'm interested in academic work, because I think the structure of South Africa tends to be very fragmented. Sometimes outside being fragmented, it's either it is contested, we don't necessarily agree that this is what's happening. Even if we don't agree, then sometimes it's almost like non-existent. So those would be my two questions.
Okay, so I think what we're going to do is, I see we've got Herman Funk, whose hand is raised, and we'll ask him to say something. Tapelo Mohapi from Abahlali, the national spokesperson, has also got his camera on. So Tapelo, do you want to say something as well?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, but
let me
get Herman Funk first, and then you. Then what we're going to do is that we're just going to sort of, because there are many questions to the panelists, and maybe we'll ask some of the panelists to respond, and then we'll take another round after that. Okay. So over to you, Mr. Funk.
Thank you very much. You know, it was a very sobering picture that has been painted by all panelists. And my question is, how do we achieve social cohesion when being led by a fragmented government? And as far as I'm concerned, the top-down kind of leadership is not working. Yet how do we channel bottom-up leadership in a way that it doesn't end up in chaos? And one of the ideas I would like to suggest is, why don't we, as active citizens, kind of combine our efforts, develop a kind of a Marshall Plan like it was implemented in Europe as a guiding kind of instrument, and really work towards not only social cohesion, but really towards economic kind of vibrancy for the population in general. Thank you.
Thank you. Tapelo Mohapi, the national spokesperson for Abahlali Mjondolo.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the panelists. I think many of you have covered a lot in reflecting on what is happening in the country. My input would be that the crisis that we are having in this country at this point in time needs it needs selfless leaders. It needs leaders that are committed to the people, to helping the people to get us out of this doldrum that we are facing. But the problem here is that our government does not give dignity and respect to people on the ground, to such an extent that they will hire an architect from Sentin to think on behalf of the people, because the people cannot think for themselves. So you will have somebody who's hired, a consultant who's hired to think on behalf of the people and finish on the people. So there is no meaningful engagement with the people themselves. And we are saying, as Abahlali Mjondolo, if the government would go down deep on the ground and hear the pleas of the people and listen to the people and let people be part of the solution that they are facing, rather than to think that people should be passive recipients of the services that they provide to them. That's why you have issues. We have a 42% unemployment rate. That's why we have issues with housing, where people are relocated in what is called the greenfield projects, far from the opportunities, because we leave the rural areas to come to the cities for better opportunities. And when you now regard housing as a roof over their head, because a house should be seen as a skills transfer, where skills have been built, where it's a poverty elevation, because it will elevate poverty within the area. So to us is that there is no engagement, meaningful engagement, consulting with the people on the ground. So we need government that is going to be grounded on the ground and speak with the people and hear the people and not undermine the people, and give each and every one the rights, dignity that they deserve, just like anyone, whether it's a middle-class person or anyone else. And that's what we saw in the unrest that happened recently. A lot of people are saying that this is a result of the faction in the ANC and the arrest of the former president. But some people did not know that there was a former president that was arrested. They saw the opportunity for them to have food on their table that they've never had. People have been subjected to a lockdown, hard lockdown. There's a pandemic, people in the informal settlement. What has happened recently, that we have noticed also in closing, comrades, is that what has happened was that we have seen what has happened in Phoenix, where many people have been killed. The concern that we are having right now, as I've said, when you have selfless leaders who grandstand, is the opportunist and fascist that has taken place in these areas, where you have the likes of other political parties like your EFF and the ANC usually going around and saying that Indians are racist and Indians are targeting Black people, and they've always been like that. And our stand as Abahlali Mjondolo has been that there's no such. We have lived side by side with the Indian community. I grew up in Bambai next to Phoenix, where during the civil war between the IFP and the ANC, we used to run to Phoenix for hiding, and we would be given refuge by the Indian community. We went to schools with the Indian community, and there's no such thing. So speaking to social cohesion, my concern is political parties who will grandstand and make themselves look good and say things that are very inciting violence and race against other people. It happens with the xenophobia that is taking place in South Africa, where our government makes it very clear that in our informal settlement that they will not provide services for people who are coming outside of the country because they don't deserve it. And that's making people who are poor to fight amongst themselves. It's politics of contempt, where you are actually making the poorest to fight amongst themselves. And you are saying that if we are speaking about true cohesion, we need selfless leaders, leaders that will encourage social cohesion, leaders that will speak responsibly when they come to this, leaders that will speak against, even if it doesn't make you popular, leaders that will speak against racism, even if it doesn't make you popular. It's not about votes, it's about having a country that will not one day erode as a result of greedy, selfish politicians who want to aspire so that they could go to parliament and their party could get votes. And that is my input today, comrades, that what is happening on the ground, yes, of course, it's been reflected very well, but there needs to be a clear communication, engagement, and consultation meaningfully with the people on the ground, but also party leaders should not grandstand and make themselves look good.
Okay, I see, Shan, can you just hang on to your question for now, or your point? We're going to just take a round of responses from the panelists, and then we'll come back to you after that, if that's okay. But just to say that, yeah, so I think virtually all the panelists have had questions posed at them. Many of them have been in the chat as well. So I'm going to ask the panelists to respond in the order that they presented, starting with Kolelwa. Can we just go in that order? I'm not going to keep calling on everyone. So from Kolelwa to Julia, from Julia to Vasu, and then Vasu to Bongiseni, if that's okay, so we can just save time. So over to you, Kolelwa.
Thank you so much, Rashid, and thank you to the participants for those questions as well, which are very good questions. I will start with the one that was directed at me specifically from Matlodi about this issue of social cohesion and social compacts, which he seems to regard as just soft issues that are not as hard-hitting as the economic issues or issues that speak to economic transformation. And this is the challenge that we had when we were starting the Indlulamiti scenarios, wherein others felt that the priority here is the economic growth. But we found that through those debates, actually, you cannot speak about the economy in South Africa without actually including social cohesion. Then that's when we had to look at the definition of social cohesion, because it has been also, it has been bastardized, so to speak, wherein people deem social cohesion to, to actually point to kumbaya moments that would happen after a win at the World Cup, or just getting along as South Africans. But to us, social cohesion is about inclusion, it's about integration, it's about meaningful participation, whether it's in the policy-making space or whether it's in informing the direction towards which the country is going. So as long as there's disparities, there's inequalities, and not everyone is included, then there's no cohesion. So that means then we have to pay specific attention to issues of trust and actually issues of, a common vision and a similar sets of values, which is something that we do not have as a country. So even within all of those, then those economic imperatives are then considered, because if we were to consider say, economic transformation or just a consideration of the restructuring of our economy, then that process would have to be inclusive. It has to be as integrated, and it has to enable effective participation. And then that also leads me to this idea of, there would be no compacts without. It could well be that, the issue of economic growth could be an issue that we can compact around, because as I've indicated, that compacting can be issue specific, but it can also be around a specific location. It can be around the community in Phoenix. It can even be about the mining communities that Bongiseni spoke to. But what then makes it significant is that we need to ensure that business is also involved. Business has to come to the party, because we tend to limit compacting to government and relations between government and communities and so on, without being mindful of big business in particular, especially when you look at these mining communities where you've got these extractive economies or companies, but you don't see that sense of compromise in terms of their operations. And that's what the spirit of compacting entails. It entails having this principle of give and take, compromise, knowing that you cannot hold strong positions, but also having a set of non-negotiables. I would suggest that we could look at the key drivers that Indlulamiti identified. Inequality, say inequality is an issue that we can potentially compact around. Then we'd have to identify our non-negotiables around that. We have to also, most importantly, which I believe is why compacting has not been successful in South Africa, is that there's been no sanctioning mechanisms. So a mining company can pollute a community's river or supply of water, but there's no effective sanctioning where that company can potentially lose their mining rights. And that could be a problem. I mean, in our research, we've referenced the Kajaj court system in Rwanda, but then again, that would be contested in South Africa because we are a human rights-based country, because human rights issues have been raised where Rwanda is concerned. But then others have said at least there is some kind of sanctioning there, wherein partners to a compact do not come to the party or do not live up to the expectations or what they had promised. In terms of what Hang we had raised about how diverse we are and how unequal we are, it is true, because then it becomes difficult for us to find that common vision, which is essential for social cohesion, or even finding a set of values that inform South Africa, or even agreeing on what the priority is for compacting. What is the issue, or what is the area? Is it KZN, or is it going to be Gauteng? We cannot even find each other when it comes to that. And that's where CODESA moment becomes important, because there was a spirit of sufficient consensus, which brings me to Hammond's input about, do we fold our arms, while, Rome is burning because the state is actually not capable? No, we shouldn't. We can, as civil society or business or any other social partners, continue with the work while ensuring that there's sufficient consensus, because if we're going to be waiting for the state, which we all know is not capable, then it actually defeats the whole purpose. And I agree with Tapelo about this moment, and I also think I alluded to that in my presentation, that this July 2021 moment should not be essentialized, because if you look at the Gwara Nation, the Gwara Nation is fertile for any opportunist, especially political opportunist, to mobilize around very narrow, selfish and interests for their own means or for their own ends. So it could have been anyone. I know we've mentioned that it was in response to the arrest of former President Zuma, but it could have been anyone who could have mobilized our society, because in Gwara Nation, we are a fertile ground for anyone, for any opportunist to mobilize. And I think I will leave it there in terms of my responses. Thank you so much, Chair.
Julia?
Thank you so much. And goodness, there have been some really, really insightful questions and inputs. I think I'll start with the question specifically directed to me, and I think it's a really important question. in a few different ways, but I would challenge the assertion that the events overturned the findings that I've presented. In some ways, I think there might be some signs of what unfolded in what I presented. Certainly, we could see already higher levels of protest, and the massive drop in government with satisfaction, I think, is really crucial in understanding the context and what ensued. I think what's also really important is that the data that I presented, due to time constraints and also because of the amount of analysis we've had time to do so far, I've been speaking about Gauteng as a whole, and I think we're all extremely conscious, and certainly some of the other inputs have highlighted this, that Gauteng and South Africa as a whole is incredibly diverse, and it's not the case that we see identical patterns everywhere. And that's in a way why I included a couple of breakdowns by population groups, because that's just one dimension along which we see some really notable differences. What we see if we look at the data, for example, on where protests are being reported by our respondents, it's very clearly concentrated in certain and typically more disadvantaged areas. So I think partly I would argue that the positive findings around social cohesion may have provided some support in not seeing perhaps the levels that were seen in KwaZulu-Natal. I would also argue that the challenges people were experiencing in their daily lives really outweigh the possibilities for social cohesion to preempt an outbreak of violence. I think, as we've heard, there really were and still are enormous levels of lived desperation and distress. I think, and I'm sorry, I've forgotten the name of the person who asked the question, but as she said when she spoke, I do think that also looking at the population groups is important, because to my mind, some of what we see suggests that in an average sense, Black African residents of Gauteng and white residents of Gauteng are almost living in different realities. I mean, the differences in the perceptions about whether Blacks and whites will ever trust each other are completely different. And I think that that's actually critically important. I think we need to break some of these findings down further to really properly understand what types of social cohesion we're seeing in different places and what the implications of that might be. I think the last thing I want to mention is sort of a question in itself that some of these inputs have triggered for me, which is really, I mean, we speak about social cohesion, but I've been speaking particularly about Gauteng, but we've also heard about other parts of the country in different contexts, and the country as a whole. And in thinking about this, the social contract, obviously a national social compact is imperative, but I think that within smaller communities and groups, the qual data does suggest that we're already seeing that there are strong and functioning social compacts. And I suppose the question in my mind is, how do we pull those together and begin to create something at a larger scale? I think I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Rashid. Let me start with Ashraf Adams' question. Ashraf was my successor as SRC president at Durban Westville. Ashraf, your question about the role of municipalities in social cohesion, and let me tie it to some of the other issues that were raised by Tapelo and Herman as well. So I think, Ashraf, definitely municipalities have a key role. And that's because social cohesion, as Aman correctly pointed out, can't come just from the top. It has to come from the bottom, and there municipalities play a key role. One of the major problems with social cohesion, as we know now, everybody's talked about here, is economic exclusion. And there, I think municipalities have a major role, because municipalities should be using their budgets also for economic, not just for development, but through development for economic empowerment, not economic enrichment, which has come through all the corrupt tenders and all of that that we have seen. But there are huge budgets. Even here in Tekwini, for example, I think it's something like 40, now 50 billion rands per annum. Those are huge budgets which can be used for economic empowerment. The second is service delivery, service delivery, service delivery. You need a capable state to deliver services, because the lack of service delivery leads to conflict, and conflict leads to the breakdown of social cohesion also. The third is how to break down the apartheid spatial development barriers, both the physical barriers and the psychological barriers. And we have seen now one of the drivers of the recent events in July was the fact that, and understandably so, because it's not an easy thing to do, that we failed to dismantle the spatial development of apartheid. And in fact, to a large extent, it got exacerbated with the buildup of informal settlements. And this is a recipe for racial conflict, class conflict, all of that. Again, things that negate social cohesion. And here we are not going to get complete social cohesion. You are just going to mitigate factors that drive social incohesion. So how do we mitigate that? And there, I think municipalities can play a very important role, because as Tapelo also correctly pointed out, because he knows, Abashlali is here, they're working with the local communities, that local councillors are major players in social incohesion. They're driving a lot of the conflicts here, not all of them, but I sat on the commission investigating political killings. I sat on the commission that looked at violence against foreigners in 2015, as well as the Commission on Social Cohesion, all in this province. And one of the key findings we had in all of these is that local councillors were involved. So I think, again, there's a lot of education that needs to be done in working with local councillors. And we know that we've got a local government elections coming up in a month's time, and we will see again a rise in these incidents. So I think there, Ashraf, to answer your question, municipalities have a vital role to play in social cohesion, and that's where social cohesion is going to happen. And then maybe just to quickly answer Motlodi's question, are we ready to have a conversation about breaking with the colonial hegemony? I think we have no choice in the matter. what we have realized, and I think, Matlodi, what we have to reflect on is that despite the well-meaning policies that the ANC put in place and that was negotiated, even though it was negotiated as a compromise, I have to say that even in retrospect, I will not criticize the compromise that was reached at CODESA. I know many people do, because I think it was a balance between stability at the time and economic and social transformation. And I think we came out more on the side of stability, correctly so. And now we had to obviously look at economic and social transformation, and the various programs, RDP, here as GISA and whatever else came in between, together with the National Development Program, is all aimed at dealing with this problem of social and economic transformation. But it's proved to be a very, very difficult, complex, and challenging project, one of social and economic transformation. And I think what the 6 days in July has created is an opportunity. More than that, it was in many senses a tragedy for the country and for social cohesion and all the rest of it. But it was a huge opportunity for a new social compact, because it created the environment. And what is that environment? Is that people on all sides realize that either we're going to build this country together, or we are all going to perish together. And I'm not being dramatic about it, because I was here in the middle of it, and I've seen how the weapons and the arms that communities, private communities took to, and we know that, yes, even in other communities, they are awash with weapons, and we're sitting with social ills that can drive all of this. There are many, many fault lines in the country that can move us very, very quickly into a situation of civil conflict edging towards civil war. Again, I'm not being dramatic, because I was there with our former Deputy Minister Aziz Pahad in Damascus, in Syria, when they were throwing stones. And yes, we were then in a very stable country talking to people. And it was a short time before Syria moved into conflict. We've seen that repeatedly in a number of countries on the continent. There's no exceptionalism here in South Africa. So there is an urgent need. There is now the environment. I think people on all sides realize the stakes are high. Either you're going to take a passport and leave the country, or you're going to sit here and reconstruct the country. That opportunity exists. It must be driven both from the top and from the bottom. Thanks, Rashid.
So let me take off from something that Vasu again has just said, which is, I mean, you said you are not going to criticize the settlement of the 1990s, but I think one of the things we do also need to do is, in thinking about how we've got here, is have honest conversations about some of the mistakes that we've made since the advent of democracy. Let me point to just one example of what I'm talking about. In 1996, there was, on one hand, there were two laws or two white papers written. One was dealing with electricity distribution, and the other one was dealing with the question of setting up wall-to-wall local government. There were two papers written in the same year, and they fundamentally contradict each other, which has led to an impasse today. How do they contradict each other? The electricity distribution paper says municipalities should think of moving away from selling electricity because that is something that is not profitable. Whereas the local government paper, the fiscal framework we have today, says local municipalities should be making 73% of their budgets from selling electricity and from rates and taxes. So there's a fundamental mistake that was made there, where we were deciding to experiment with local government at a scale we'd never had before, to go back to the point Matlodi makes about the colonial state, where electricity distribution had only been thought of for a small portion of the population. And when we're thinking about how do we expand these services, we're saying, let's make them affordable, and where people cannot afford the services, the state will provide free basic services. What the ultimate problem that has landed us with is that municipalities don't have money to do basic maintenance of things, and things are falling apart. That's based on a fundamental mistake that was made in the democratic era. So we do need to have honest conversations about mistakes that we've made in the democratic era. And I don't think we do enough of that. One of the things we don't do in South Africa is really look back with a critical eye on some of what we have done in the democratic era, and take informed decisions about some of the fundamental readjustments that we need to make. So that's one example. There are linking that to the point Kolelwa made about social compacting, and I want to also link it to what Herman raised. I think Herman has put his finger on one of the biggest elephants in the room, which is divided leadership at the top. And here we need to think about political parties. We need to think about the ruling party, the African National Congress. I think you are absolutely right, Kolelwa, that social compacting in the way that you've outlined is part of what is going to help us begin to think our way forward, to begin to think of how we get ourselves out of the mess that we're in. But again, I think that social compacting rests on honest conversations. I think we do need to have that. And politicians, I think, as Tapelo said, and as Vasu said, are often part of compounding the problem because they're not wanting to have honest conversations. So I think Herman's point again about leadership from below, in the way that Tapelo, and other organizations I'm associated with, such as the Alliance for Rural Democracy, are trying to do, are some of the ways in which we're going to find ways of moving forward. I also want to point out that in thinking about social compacting, one of the things we need to also keep firmly in our view is that the downside of globalization, for example, when it comes to what Kolelo was talking about in terms of mining, is that it allows let's say, mining companies from Canada, from Australia, from the UK, etc., to check out. Right? It allows them to extract from the country and not really get their hands dirty, except to buy certain chiefs to put them on their boards, etc., when it comes to how to fix the problems of the country. And so, again, the question of political leadership that can hold the private sector accountable, that does not allow it to check out, is a critical element in thinking about the kind of social compacting that Kolelo was talking about. And then let me bring that back then to the question of rural areas, the question of land that Nonkubela has asked, and what Professor Vilnkomo has put in the chat around whether rural areas have deteriorated to the point of no return. Nonkubela, I think on your question of farms that have been given to people that are lying fallow. So one thing I need to clarify is that I'm not by no means suggesting that land needs to be given to people as individuals. The Ngonyama Trust case again points us to something very important, which a lot of people have been arguing for a long time, which is there are customary ways in which people have lived on, have used, have accessed land that to this day have maintained continuity with the pre-colonial past in many ways. And those are ways in which people want to live on, want to use land. One of the wrong-headed ways in which the state, I think, has pursued land reform, one is focused very narrowly on returning land that was taken from people after 1913, or from 1913 onwards. When people had lost land well prior to 1913 in some instances. But again, it's another of those compromises, as Vasu was talking about, that were made. But what the state has tried to do also is to try and turn people into farmers, right? Where it's returning people to land that was taken from them, turned into productive farms, and try and turn people who have no interest in farming into farmers. And a lot of people have taken the opportunity because they have no other opportunity, but really have absolutely no desire to become farmers. So that question, I mean, and the Mutlante panel that Parliament had set up to review legislation. One of the things it made very clear is what we haven't been able to do well in South Africa is actually ask the question of who wants land for what purposes, and then think about land reform that addresses the actual needs that people have. In urban areas, what do people want land for? Those are the questions that we haven't answered well enough for ourselves. And this is, again, goes back to this question of leadership from the top that comes with pat solutions, in some instances preferred by the World Bank, which had a strong hand, in fact, in influencing our land reform policies in the 1990s. And so the honest conversations have to go back there to asking ourselves the questions, the fundamental questions that we just have come up with solutions without really actually understanding the problems, analyzing the problems, and putting our finger on what people actually want. I want to also then end on answering Professor Vilnkomo's question, or trying to answer that question, which is to say, I mean, it's so uneven in rural areas. There are places where, say, an environmental degradation as a result of mining has put some places beyond the pale, where recovery is at this point not possible, where the water sources, as Tolelo mentioned, are so badly polluted that some places are becoming uninhabitable. There are also places, I mean, one of my teams, for example, has been working in the Eastern Cape and in Mpumalanga, looking at some of the new settlement patterns that we're seeing. And what we're seeing, and somebody wrote about it in the City Press over the last weekend, is a lot of urban-based people going to traditional authority areas, acquiring land very cheaply and building mansions, or even new townships being developed in traditional authority areas that completely bypass all the laws around zoning, around planning that we have in the country. And so there are places where things are happening, where there's land available, and that traditional authorities are playing a hand in distributing, that potentially itself is going to be a cause of conflict in the future. And then there are places where, I mean, there's still productive farming land that can itself be redistributed. The redistribution program of our land reform program has simply not been used enough in this country. And this is what, I mean, people who've been writing on this, including Tembeka and Zwaitobi, have been pointing out. We focus so much on land restitution, and some of the instruments that we have available to us, such as redistribution, have just not been used sufficiently. And those are some of the instruments that need to be brought into use to try and alleviate some of the conflicts that might arise as a result of how badly, in fact, we've handled the land reform program in the country. Let me stop there for now. Thank you.
Okay, I think those were very comprehensive responses to the questions. I'm going to move to the sort of the second part and open it up to a number of questions again. The first person is Sean Bolton, whose hand was up just before we made that decision, followed by Ishlam Kabela, Lisa Sefto, Bongani Kupe, and Remofilwe Morekisi. So I'm going to do this. I mean, again, I'm just going to ask people to go straight into their thing, so we save a bit of time. Sean, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Rash. Look, I think we're talking around much of what we all know to be the problem in the country. Firstly, that this is fundamentally a country and a government that is corrupt to its core, and that corruption permeates right down to the very local level in almost every ward in this country. So when we talk about rebuilding communities, it assumes that there was something that needs to be rebuilt, or there's something that was destroyed. Other than this insurrection period, I think we've had almost 2 decades or more of localities that have just not been developed, have been underdeveloped, or completely ignored across the length and breadth of the country. At the core of this, and I think people have identified, is the politics of this country that is not orientated towards the kind of development needs, doesn't have the capacity to do the work that is required, doesn't have the culture to do the work that is required, has a public service that is really not in service of the public by and large, aside from, I think, the more critical areas in pockets of health and maybe in education, to a limited degree in policing. But the rest of it, where people have been absent from work during COVID, has not been visible at all. Its impact has just been minimal. So that's at the heart of what you have. And then you have an economy that just doesn't work. You have you have a business here, an organized business, big and small, who I wouldn't lump into one category, but I don't think share into a vision, because there isn't a collective vision for this country. We are also at a point where this collapse, we've been doing work in a place like Orange Farm, Fine Town, Wheelers Farm, all of these areas in the last few years. And you just have to go there to see the extent of the damage that a careless government inflicts upon people. So in Orange Farm, you have open manhole covers. And 2 weeks ago, a 6-year-old falls into this thing. And a community there, up until today, that thing they themselves had to go and close. You have in Lahai, a library gets built 5 years ago. Today, there's a community protest to actually open something that should have been opened and should have been of service to this community. Now, that kind of lethargic public service or government was very evident during the COVID period. If it were not for community initiative, the Community Action Network set up primarily in the Cape, parts in Gauteng, I think the devastation would have been much greater, because it was really communities finding themselves needing to support each other that saved much of these areas. So the Gcro studies talk of intra-community trust. That's got nothing to do with participatory democracy. It's really people losing faith and confidence, and that's the Afrobarometer study would have confirmed, would have the kind of loss of faith in government and political structures by and large means that people look internally, they look at the neighbors, they look at the streets, and they begin to organize themselves around it. That can have positive, but also very negative consequences. You've seen across the length and breadth of the country what this means is people then opt out of municipal structures because they can't deliver the services. They set up their own cooperatives and they start delivering. Go and look at places like Senekal, Harrismith, and many other places across the country where you see what you would be calling rebuilding, but it's rebuilding outside of the systems of government. And that might well be where models are beginning to emerge for changing a system of governance that is really not working. And the potential of it working, I think, is even questionable, because the people who will make this work are ultimately the same ones who belong to the same political parties who have created the very same problems that we're hoping they will solve. And that's just not going to happen. Where do we go? I've just been rereading something that Max Sisulu spoke about at the Education Conference in 1986. And we need to rethink about models of people's power in a democratic system. And Max, just to read very quickly here, it says people exercise power by starting to take control in areas such as crime, the clearing of townships, and the creation of people's parks, the provision of first aid, and even in schools. I want to emphasize here that these advances were only possible because of the developments of democratic organs or committees of people's power. Our people set up bodies which were controlled by and accountable to the masses of people in each area. And it goes on to elaborate about that kind of work. Now that is the missing ingredient, where civic capacity, civic reorganizing is where I think you will find the elements of community rebuilding. Just to conclude, I think there's been an explosion of community initiatives and attempts to deal with very local issues across the length and breadth of the country. At some point, their capacity, I think, or rather their interest will begin to coalesce, and you might begin to see bigger national movements. But for now, it is within these civic structures, Abashlali and many others, the Makanda Community Forum and other development forums, who have taken very bold moves to actually start looking at going into political office. Because for a long time, civil society structures have been of the view that they can't be in government. Their job is to hold government accountable. I think we perhaps have moved beyond that, where people think that there's a better opportunity to go in, create new systems of governance and accountability, and perhaps reshape the politics from the bottom up. And that hopefully will find national resonance, because we have been for far too long been trapped by party political loyalties and only thinking of politics through the party political system and mindset. And perhaps that is what would need to give way, so that we can begin to rethink the fundamentals of our democracy. And in that context, I think community rebuilding might have a better chance of being much more sustainable. Thanks, Rash.
Thanks, Sean. I think, yeah, the point about a bottom-up approach certainly is a complementary one to social compacting. Just a little correction. It was Zwelaki Sisulu, not Max Sisulu, in case people feel that they were a bit confused by that. Let me get Braish as next, followed by Lisa and then Bongani.
Thanks very much, Rashid. I have few questions, and I've made some observations. And the observation is that from the presentation we received on the attitudes of communities, I observed that there is more trust among community members. Maybe we need to explore a bit the need to build and organize and rebuild based on specific communities, because I think they protest and sometimes they could stand together with a sense of being community, abstract as it is. I feel maybe we could do some work there. I'm also asking myself whether are we capable to have constructive, creative social dialogue, a point which is related as well to NetLeg, and Lisa might comment on that. I think if we look back at the time when there was negotiation for a new dispensation, the government of the day had come to accept that they are incapable of running this country. But I think we have a situation where the current regime or government, incapable as there's a denial that they will not get the things right, and others will hide around schizophrenic economic systems that maybe if we're more socialist, will be more capable. I think we can put whatever slogans or put whatever T-shirts on our own persons. But if we have no ideas to work around what is needed, we'll fail. I think the fact that the apartheid government had come to accept that it is incapable of getting things right. It allowed for social dialogue on electricity, on housing. I was part of the National Housing Forum, on local government and other fora, which fed their discussions, which is social dialogue. which involved business, social or civic bodies, or community bodies, as well as the old apartheid government. So there was a level of accepting that neither the government or society or the new forces of liberation can get things right. So there was that the way of coming together. By way of summarizing, I would like to ask myself that maybe we need to think more of what is inhibiting a formation of social compact. And if I'm hard, is really this thinking in ideological concept. Maybe politics does actually divide us. Maybe we need to find out of what would help us or enable us have social compacts and partnership to improve our situation. And of course, we also need to accept that where there are enabling forces, there are inhibitions. Without overcoming them, all the things we may be talking about might sound desirable, but will not be able to achieve them. So I'm actually thinking that maybe we need to invest on finding mediating skills, which will help communities and sectors to work together to find solutions. And therefore, we'll be able to have viable social compacts, which will help the situation. I think otherwise we'll remain with self-preservation or self-promoting groups, be they political, social, or economic, at the expense of country and people. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Braish. I think that I was, you said about what is inhibiting social compacts. And I found it very interesting that yesterday, BUSA came out and they said, well, they're against the basic income grant. Okay, at the same time, NUMSA said we're going on strike. Okay, the government wasn't anywhere to be found. So the problem actually sits with Lisa Seftel, who has to mediate all of these conflicts. So Lisa, please tell us how you're going to deal with all of these very diverse, with these very diverse.
I've been unfairly set up, and I'm also mindful that some of the other partners in NEDLAC, including Martin Kingston, are also in the room, so don't put it all on me. But maybe I'm going to start off by trying to answer very briefly Ishmael's question, and then I'm going to make the comments I wanted to make, and talk about the social compact that we tried in NEDLAC around the July incident. I think, Braish, what are the requirements of social compacting? 1, capability, and 2, trust. And as I'll explain later, well, there's a lack of capability, and I think others have talked about it in the state, and maybe even less capability in the state than in communities, as Sean was talking about. And on trust, we heard from Gcro and from other studies like the Afrobarometer that government is facing a serious crisis on trust. But I think, I really do identify with what Sean is saying, and to some extent, what I'm going to say is, is to complement what he's saying, because I understand that out of these workshops, there's going to be a paper about a provocation, and I think that there are some really important issues that need to be explored from here before you write the paper. The first is the issue that also Kolelo raised. Was the July, to the week in July, was that just more Gwara Gwara, a continuum of Gwara Gwara, or was it a significant moment of change in South Africa's political and social economy? And I think one does need to look at that. And I think there was a continuum, but there was also something that is different. The second question I think to also ask is, was what happened in KZN and Gauteng the same? And I don't think it's been addressed necessarily here. Because, and I've also done work in my other capacity as a VIT student on violence in the taxi industry. And there is significant intergenerational violence and a continuum of violence, particularly in KZN, from the time of Bambata Rebellion and so on, the Inkatha UDF conflicts and so on. And is that a continuum that continues today and had a role in the way in which violence was initiated? What did the instigators want to accomplish by violence, and what did violence accomplish? I think that's the second area that should be explored. And then to talk about this issue of social compacts. So in NEDLAC, in the first week of July, the social partners did feel that there was a need for a comprehensive package or a comprehensive response. And there were a number of meetings, and they identified the response, and I think the president announced it when he spoke on the Sunday evening, that there needed to be the stabilization of the security situation, firstly. Secondly, that the supply chains were about to be disrupted, they needed to be retained. Thirdly, that there needed to be relief of different sorts. And lastly, there needed to be the support, this active citizenry, the protecting and cleaning up and so on. And you saw some ministers going and helping to clean up. Now, and I really agree, I think, with what Cord was saying, that one of the critical things, and I think, is that the state no longer has a monopoly of violence and people go for their own violent solutions. And we saw in that period that the state could not deliver at the speed in which it needed to the security solution. But they did eventually come to the party. When it came to supply chains, and I think, if you want to do this provocation, and, we need to look back and say, who sorted out the supply chains? That's when business and government were very keen to work together. And they, and they did collaborate quite intensively. Then there was the issue of relief. And government made a lot of promises. And we tried to facilitate it in NEDLAC. Government did not have the capability to deliver. 3 months after this incident, businesses who were promised relief from UI for their workers have not got it. Now, where is business going to have the trust, big and small, when government says we'll give you relief so that you don't retrench, but actually you rebuild and you don't get it? A website where you can register that you need relief was set up, I think, a week ago or 2 weeks ago. So I think there are, it comes down to, as I said, I'm coming back to the what I said at the beginning. If government doesn't have the capability and doesn't have the trust, it's very hard to have social compacts. And that's why, as Sean is saying, people then have compacts amongst themselves in communities, not with government, but with people that they can trust and that they can be relied on to deliver. And those have got good parts and bad parts. So the taxi industry, which is generally seen as, unreliable and feared, etc., in some communities, were the strongest allies. Taxi industry were standing outside malls and defending malls, and they were heroes of communities. In Diepsloot, the taxi industry was going door to door in the informal settlement and making sure that every shack person opened their shack doors and checked where there were stolen goods and took the stolen goods back to the mall. I think it was an extension 6 or extension 7. So, and it's a fine line between community protection and vigilantism. But I think that's, again, in the, how can I put it, in your provocation, I think you need to explore these things in more detail. I think you need to look not only at what happened in that week of July, but what has been the responses of the social partners and communities post that week. Thanks, Rashid. And thanks for organizing this. It's been very interesting.
Thanks, Lisa. Okay, so can I just say at this stage, we are now sitting at 4:20. I know it's been almost an hour and 2.5 hours or something, and we need to sort of begin to move towards closure. So we've got Bongani Kupe, who's next, Remo Filwe, and then Abba Umar in that order. And I think Abba being a sort of co-host in the form of Mistra, I think it'll be useful to have his sort of overarching take. And then we'll give all of the panelists maybe 2 minutes, 1 or 2 minutes, just to round up very quickly, and then we'll take and then we'll head for closure. So we are on track to complete by 5 o'clock as we had promised. So over to you, Mr. Kupe.
Yeah, thank you very much, Rashid. I think for me, just to be, I'll try and be short. One, I think Raish asked a question about social cohesion compact. And I think for me, 2 issues are important. There's issue of poverty and unemployment. If you still have those as fundamentals defining communities, we are very far from social cohesion. We're not going to achieve it. I think the second thing I wanted to basically also talk to is the whole issue of poverty. I think in this country, there have been so many studies about poverty, people, unemployment, poverty, and things like that. I'm here to see studies that find solution to that problem that could be implemented so that we can get rid of poverty and get rid of unemployment. The third thing I think Dr. Buthelezi pointed out to it is that there's been a relationship of extraction instead of construction. I mean, if you look at the Northwest, I mean, I think every square meter in the Northwest, there's a mineral there, but there's not even one institution that talks to mining or whatever. Universities in the Northwest talks to everything else, but not what is going to build in that community. So I think with the creation of malls, you find that. But also my other point is we don't have a capable state. I think everyone who's spoken here talks about a state that is not capable. I think someone must be able to look at what is the problem and we deal with it, because with 25 years down the line, and these things are getting worse instead of we're all starting the next one and the next one. And I suspect we are going to have the July things in the next few years or so if we don't deal with it, but we only study it. But lastly, I mean, if you listen to politicians talk and all of us talk, every one of us is saying we should be, this is what needs to happen and things like that. No one is saying, guys, from now on, this is what we are doing and let's check whether this works or not, because everyone has complained. I mean, the state said they are going to compensate people that, have lost staff. They're going to do this. It's just the basic things are difficult to get from water. I mean, people have to protest in order for them to get water. So I think we need to get to a point of stop studying these things and start doing them. I don't know how we can do it, but I think someone amongst ourselves, we should start saying, we stop saying we should say we have done it, it worked in such a community, and this is how we play forward. So I think we need to start look at how in action form we're going to do these things instead of continuously starting one event after another event and not be able to get solutions that are going to work. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Can we ask Remo Filwe to come in?
Thank you very much, Rashad. With all the speakers and all the panelists, I think they provide a very clear discourse of where we are now as a country. And but one aspect, maybe some observations that I've made and some comments that I have is that when we look at the social cohesion issue, we also need to consider the approach of internal colonialism, that where we are now, we need to appreciate the fact that both the previously oppressed and the oppressed are living in the same land. And when they are living in the same land, we still have policies which favor them more, or we still have a system that actually kind of separates the majority and the minority. And the other comment that I have is that in addition to that, we also look at the path dependency of some institutions that we have in the country, that, you know, there are some systems or there are some of their implementing strategies that are being used today that were used in the apartheid era. I think that's what hinders mostly with service delivery, and that's what brings us to a whole lot of social unrest that we have in our communities. And the second aspect, Bongiseni spoke about the issue of water. I also wanted to bring in the issue of water, that, you know, we also need to appreciate the fact that the land issue and the water issue, they go in parallel. When someone actually attains the land, they also need to have water rights. And most of the land, what we have been dealing with in the sector that I'm in, we've been dealing with instances whereby the land is transferred to Black farmers, but because they do not have knowledge about them attaining water rights, then they use water that is from the irrigation boards. And then after that, what happens is that the irrigation boards, they come and they claim a certain amount from the farmers, saying that this is how much you owe us because you have used the water from our canal. And what the National Water Act does is that it allows the irrigation boards to actually attach the land as a form of remuneration for the farmers, from the farmers, for the amount of water that the amount of money that they used their water from. So I would say that that is one of the challenges that we are facing now in terms of the land issue. And also in municipalities, you know, again, Bongiseni spoke about the issue of water. Also, in municipalities, you would find that the domestic water that they are using, that they are giving to communities, most of the water actually is paid to the irrigation boards, so that the irrigation boards can give us water. And now that it puts the municipalities in a situation whereby they would have to buy water for a whole lot of money. So these are the aspects that I wanted to bring forward to the House, that, you know, we should also, in terms of when we tackle these issues, also consider other approaches or consider other aspects that play a big role in the issues that are at hand today. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. I mean, I think that, I think you make an important point in terms of, and the difficulty is the inflexibility in government and the, you know, the lack of innovation, or not sort of allowing for innovation, for co-production, and so on. And I think that we need to see how we deal with that matter. Eba, before you come in, because I want you to kind of help us conclude this session, being one of the co-hosts of the series, before we get the final word from the panelists. But because I think a whole number of things have been said, I quite liked what Sandy Africa was saying. For colleagues who don't know who Sandy Africa is, you might have heard her name being mentioned by the president a few weeks ago. She's a professor at UP, and she's also the chairperson on the expert panel, which is reviewing government's response to the July events. And she had to say, so because I'm sure she's still busy with her work, maybe she doesn't say too much, but I mean, she's put this really interesting thing, which I want to read out. Thanks to all speakers and audience for the fresh ideas. I agree with Bongiseni and so many others who've spoken today. These ideas need to be mainstreamed and form the basis for action. We clearly need disruptive innovation. Yeah, I think, thank you for that, Sandy. One more thing, can I just, I don't know if Mduduzi wants to say anything, because nobody from government has said anything. So Mdu, you're unfortunately the only major representative of government here from provincial government, the head of the policy unit in the office of the Premier. Do you want to say a few words? I know you've got a bad connection, so maybe it's not going to quite work for you. No, I think Mdu was struggling with his connection. So in which case, over to you, Eba. Thank you.
I would have loved to have heard what government has to say, but shame poor Mdu will have to represent all of government. Some very quick points. So thanks also to all the panelists. I'm glad you mentioned Sandy Africa's comment and the role she's playing. She obviously needs to get as many of these kind of inputs as possible so that her panel has a much more enriched look at when they analyze what happened in July. So I think there are a couple of themes here, and I'm glad that we're actually having this as a series so that we can pick these up as we go forward. And I hope that all the participants that are here would attend the next two series as well. So some of the themes, one is what's this violence about? And as usual, I think South Africans, we're very good at navel gazing, and we've been looking at it. So some people, like Stephen Friedman, has said this was a test of our democracy, and it was a clash of elites. So I think that's one sort of aspect of the whole thing. And then what I found useful was Zizek, the philosopher's take, where he spoke of visible and invisible violence. And he said that there's the invisible violence of inequality. Like if you look at gender-based violence, the whole invisible violence of patriarchy, etc., that lies at the core of this. And I think we've spoken a lot of that. And then we ask ourselves the question, like, how does this erupt into violence? And also, I think we need to keep that in mind when looking at the theme of rebuilding communities. I think the other point we need to keep in mind is the history of violence. And I saw Hershila raise the question in the chat, like why Gauteng and KZN? I think if you look back, I was just looking up some of the statistics now, that of the just the water and sanitation protests over the past between 2013 and 2018, just for those 5 years, there were 588 protests, of which 378 were deemed violent. And of that, 90 occurred in Gauteng, 81 occurred in KZN, 77 in the Western Cape, and Eastern Cape had 52. So in a sense, there's been this history of violence already in many senses. And as some speakers say, we could go back to the Bambata Rebellion, or we could go forward to the Sharpeville Massacre, or we could go to June 16th, etc. That there's been huge acts of violence against people, and then also protests that have been conducted in the name of democracy and so forth. So we need to keep that in mind, understand what does this mean for our society. And I think that'll be useful as panelists comment, like what does it mean at the community level. There are two webinars coming up. One is on the economy and the other one is on government itself. One of the things that's clear about the economic issues, and I think what we've been saying here, there's a plethora of suggestions that come up. But what's clear is that post-1994, there hasn't been a single clear overriding economic policy. We've had GEAR, and then we had the NGP, and et cetera, and then we've had responses to crises like responding to a great financial crisis, etc. So, I keep wondering, like, is it possible? And maybe this is something panelists could look at for next time, but maybe comment now. Is it possible for a single overriding economic policy that is focused, I would think, growing the economy for prosperity of all, and then looking at the kind of underlying issues there, that what does it require of the business sector, of labor, and so forth, and the kind of issues that have been raised around being able to arrive at a common commitment and so forth. Because at one level, there will always be the mistrust that Lisa has spoken of. Just like my previous job was with the banks, people that choose my career very well. I used to work at Armsco. I was an arms dealer there. Then I was a government propagandist, and I worked for the banks. So, you seem to like all these nefarious activities. But there's a sense of indebtedness that people feel because of the private sector. And I think we all know that there's a number of issues that go with that, like low wages, et cetera, the black tax and that kind of thing. But there's also other reasons for being suspicious of the private sector. Steinhoff, Exxon, KPMG, all those kind of scandals. And the corporate sector seems to always be getting away with it. So there's a built-in sort of attitude that, well, you can't trust the private sector, government should provide, and that can be, so that's the one thing on one side. Then the second thing, which I think Sean was kind of raising, and other colleagues have made inputs there about the bottom-up approach. Good, Senecal and a whole lot of numbers where, and the communities and the taxi association that came together and protected communities and filled in the role where the state is. But it obviously at one level speaks to the vacuum and the incapability that we have. But is it a desirable state? How can we build that state? One that is not kind of beholden to the current sort of dynamics where you just simply can't get a president to lead the kind of reforms that are required to make the state more capable. So that then leads me to the last question then. Who are we at this plenary and what do we represent? And I was thinking that Vasu just turned 60 over the weekend, so you can sing happy birthday to him later, Chair. But there's a swathe of us that are above 60. And then you look at people like Xolelwa and others who are between 40 and 60. And then there's the whole sprinkling like Hangwi who haven't even reached 40, I think. So my sense is that those of us that are in the 60s and above, we're so caught up with a kind of arrangement that we just can't seem to step out of that paradigm. And that I hope that over the next couple of webinars that we can actually talk a way out of that paradigm. But if we don't, July uprisings is going to be a conflagration taking over the whole country, not just these spots that we saw. And then in doing that, we'll have to answer the question that Lisa was raising, the issue of trust. How do we make sure people can trust the state institution? And hand in hand with that is the issue of hope. How can you give people hope that who can't feed their children, can't clothe them, who can't school them, who can't transport them, who are not sure where the next rand or 2 rand is going to come from? Thank you, Chair. Wonderful chairing, and I think great session. I look forward to what the panelists have to say.
Thank you, Eva. Yeah, just to say, before we get the panelists, I'm looking at my time. We very much within time. Herschela, your question about the ERRP and whether it's the right thing to kind of address our economic malaise is something that we will reserve for the next session, as Abba was saying earlier on. And I think there we're going to unpack some of those issues. So please come to the next session and please raise that issue. Okay, colleagues, what I'm going to ask the panelists to do is spend like maybe 2 or 3 minutes at the most, just to sort of round up. If there are any sort of outstanding issues that you want to sort of close the circle, please do so. And perhaps you want to say 1 or 2 things about how do we sort of move forward? What are the 1 or 2 ideas that we think might take us forward in rebuilding? And that's really the theme. So let me start. Maybe I should start in reverse order. So let me start with Bongiseni, and then I'm going to go up all the way to Xolelwa, if that's okay.
Thank you, Chair. Let me, I'll be very brief. I think, I mean, what Sean offered us is something very useful to think with, which is that organizing from below, where people are actually getting together to fill the voids where the state is incapable of delivering things that they need. And what that might look like as it builds up into a broader movement offers us, I think, something useful that we need to watch, to be involved in, and to think with. The downside of it, which we also need not forget, is that some of what we're seeing is, it goes back to what Sean said as well, which is it's that people are checking out. Now that checking out, if we see some of the municipalities, for example, where people have taken the state to court, and courts have given judgments that say residents' association can take over certain functions, like water provision, for example. That on its own also, I think, carries within it a great deal of danger of as Sean put it, as Sean pointed out, of us building a country in which there are little islands and little pockets that people might begin to want to defend once they've built them up, defend against immigrants, defend against anybody migrating in from elsewhere. So as much as we are thinking about what building up from below might look like, there are also, I think, a great deal of dangers that we need to be alive to as we go ahead. And then the last thing I want to just say is there are also some green shoots that we need to bear in mind. So despite the contestations within the ruling party, the ruling alliance, I should say, the attempts to rebuild the state, to build a capable state, is something that I think we've gone from a period 3 years ago when the president was bemoaning that not much could be done because of the incapability of the state, to beginning to see some attempts at actually doing something about it. So I'm aware of initiatives being led. There are 5 initiatives that DPSA, for example, is doing. The National School of Government is leading an initiative to try and get well, there's a group, a task team, for example, consisting of people from business, from civil society, and from government that's trying to come up with proposals for a roadmap, in fact, of how to rebuild or build the state, actually. So those things are things we need to watch, and I think we need to be putting pressure on government to make sure that those things don't become just processes on paper. They don't deliver reports that just sit on a shelf and gather dust. And there's a role, I think, for us in business, in civil society, etc., to put pressure on government to make sure that these things deliver something that can be taken forward. And then finally, I also want to point out that an association of former directors general was formed that was launched yesterday, where people were in so far in the first and second administrations offering their own skills, their own experience to be a sounding board, to think with people who are in the state, in the present, about how they can help them troubleshoot, think through some of the problems that they are trying to solve, and how they can help them not repeat the mistakes that they themselves made in their own time, and create the space for them to make their own mistakes and make them be new ones that they create. So there are green shoots, I think, and we need to not be all doom and gloom. There are things that are being tried, and we need to get some energy behind them.
Thanks, Vasu.
Thanks, Rashid. I think it's good that Bongiseni ended on that positive note. I think, firstly, I must agree with him that we need an honest assessment. As I said, I agree with the, not that we were all satisfied with the compromise that we made during CODESA, but I agree with the fact that we opted for stability. Now we have to look at economic and social reconstruction, and we must have an honest assessment of the mistakes we made in the last 25 years. Secondly, Herman made an interesting comment. He said that if the remaining hope dwindles, July will look like a walk in the park. My expertise is in conflict management. Let me say he's absolutely correct. Right now, we have a reprieve, and the reprieve is really COVID-19. The lockdowns put a lid on conflict, a dangerous lid on conflict, because inside that lid, we know that the health crisis has led to an economic crisis. The economic crisis will lead to a security crisis and then a humanitarian crisis inside the country. So once that lid is lifted, protests will come back with a vengeance. And I think currently we have probably between 6 and 12 months as a further reprieve, and we need to do a lot in that time. So what do we need to do? Prof. Villencomo said, do we know what we want to do with South Africa beyond the rhetoric of democracy, transparency, and promises of equality? Well, we need to restore hope. And as Shan said, working with communities and the intra-trust that exists within communities and consolidating that, I think that is important to build a sense of belonging and inclusion and community solidarity. But we must not do it to the exclusion of building the state. That would be very, very dangerous. I think we have to build the state and state capacity and capability. And as Bongiseni said, there are a number of initiatives. We need to support those initiatives and ensure that we can consolidate those initiatives and that becomes a collective effort of the private sector, civil society, and the state. And then the three things that I think can be done. The first is, without a doubt, we have to make sure that all the initiatives that are out there to address the endemic and systemic corruption and culture of corruption must be consolidated. And there might be many strategies of how we deal with systemic corruption. I don't want to get into that now. The second, as I said, is build state capacity. And the third is something which we are doing now across the country, is to build mediation capacity at the community level, merely to mitigate conflicts, to create the breathing space for the transformation to take place. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Yeah, I'd like to build on that point of hope. I think that's absolutely crucial. And what our data highlights is that what we've been seeing is people not just growing poverty, but people slipping back down the socioeconomic ladder and effectively losing hope. And I think it is crucial that we address both the direct needs that are a result of poverty, the fact that a huge proportion of South Africans have very basic needs in the forms of food, basic services, healthcare, education going unmet. This really needs to be addressed. And I think in effectively addressing that, there's scope to restore an element of hope. And I think also scope to restore an element of trust with trust in government. I think what we absolutely need to see is government that is on the ground, that is really engaging and communicating with communities and community organizations and residents, acknowledging the incredibly difficult circumstances that people have been forced to live in through the failings of government in many instances, and then demonstrating the ability, the intention, and the ability to actually begin to remedy some of those difficulties and concretely provide what it is that people need. I think in doing this, government can restore some of the trust that it's lost and leave people feeling cared about, and that there is a future and a hopeful future for them in the country. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chair, and thanks for all the contributions. Again, very insightful. And as I was listening to the last round of comments, I could not help but be reminded of a concept that we've been toying around with in Indlulamiti, which is that of these silent non-agreements. And now this is a difficult area for us to engage with as citizens, or even this collective in this meeting here today. Because, and I think one of the things that triggered this is Nishan's question about how we assume that something was destroyed when there's actually just this historical continuous notion of underdevelopment for certain communities. Linked to that is Ishmael's contribution on, how do we learn from, the previous regime on wherein there was an acknowledgement of lack of capacity. What we found today is that we have a government and a ruling party that refuses to acknowledge honestly that they are not capable of creating jobs, of restructuring the economy. But also as citizens, we seem to be complicit in this. I mean, there's all these silent non-agreements. For example, what Lisa alluded to, this intergenerational violence in KZN, which seems to be, quite an elephant in the room that no one wants to speak to. And as South Africans, we seem to have this collective notion of trying to not upset the Rainbow Nation. And you see evidence of that even in the July moment, wherein as citizens, we quickly went out the next day to clean up our streets, because it seems like we do understand deeply, the extent of the violence that we are capable of. So whenever we are about to reach that tipping point, we sort of like put this band-aid over our festering gunshot wound as a collective. But it's easier for us to point to the state and the lack of capacity. Do we have capacity as citizens to have an honest conversation about the historical wound? This is also something that Vasu also alluded to about these dialogues, because we also need to be able to address these things in a very pointed manner. But we seem to also come, and we close rank as citizens whenever we feel that the tipping point is near, and we quickly, mobilize all our various band-aids, and yet that historical and intergenerational wound continues to fester. So how do we look at ourselves, and how do we also contribute to this before we can even start pointing fingers? How do we have an honest conversation? Because sometimes I feel like we're only scratching the surface and not really cleaning out that wound so that it can heal effectively. I think I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Okay, I think that brings us to the end of this amazing session. I think that if you look at the chat, we've had very, very complimentary comments from the participants. Thank you very much for that. I know there are one or two issues that people have raised about participation of government and business. We will make sure that in subsequent ones that we have the kind of active participation, and that is the idea anyway. So I think I'm not really going to summarize, because I think Abba brought a lot of the issues together. But of course, we still have two more to go, and we will be integrating all of that into the provocation that we're speaking about right at the beginning. So that will sort of give us, because the interconnections between these three dimensions are absolute. And I think that it will be an important sort of way of us having a comprehensive understanding about how we move forward. Of course, I mean, it's not the last word on the matter. It's our contribution to the debate. And when I say our, I mean the panelists as well as all of the participants. So let me just finally thank a couple of people. I have to start off with the engine room. And the engine room is really the people who are behind the scenes, who don't get all the glory, but actually have made this to happen in every way. And let me start off with Tamlin Fleetwood, who's a service provider to us, and she's done a fantastic job, having been asked at very short notice to get the thing together. And as you can see, we've had a phenomenal response. So thank you, Tamlin. From within the GCRO, Melinda Swift and Ruth Mohammed have been, I think, our two backroom persons, as it were. And from Mistra, Sibokazi Sengu, and Noma Moyo. So this team has been indispensable in putting everything together. So thank you very much. Secondly, thank you very much to all the panelists. I think it was really, we kept you under pressure in terms of the amount of time you had, but I think you were really able to give us a very good sense of your contribution, as well as the subsequent interventions that you made. And of course, the participants. I think that we've had an enormously rich, productive, and insightful discussion. And I think that's thanks to all of you. And I think our ability now to marshal all of this stuff into a coherent storyline is a challenge that is before us. But I think we certainly see the green shoots, let me use that word, very much in evidence. And of course, green shoots being spring now, so I think it is an appropriate word to use. With that, colleagues, friends, it is now 5 to 5, which is exactly the time that we said we're going to finish. So I think thanks to everyone for keeping to time, and I think managing the process. And goodbye, and we hope to see you at our next event, which will be on the 28th of October, also at 2 p.m., which will be focusing on the economy. Please remember, we're still under level 2 of the lockdown, so please stay safe, observe all the COVID protocols, and I think we should be fine. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you. Long live the chair.